Welcome to It's Complicated, a conversation series at the Autry Museum located on Tongva homelands in Los Angeles. This series brings together a variety of voices to discuss the legacies of historical people, places, and events, which are sometimes difficult and regrettable. We will leave it to others to put figures up on pedestals or take them down. Our question is, how do we today choose to live with the history we have inherited and use it to move forward? John Muir's legacy. Whose land is it anyway? The starting point for today's conversation is John Muir, the Scottish-American writer and naturalist who advocated for the preservation of his favorite parts of nature, especially here in California. His name and likeness are all over the state. He even appears on the state quarter. Yet in the summer of 2020, Muir came in for a reevaluation, even from the Sierra Club, of which he was a figurehead. Beyond Muir, many of the early leaders of the environmental movement believed in white supremacy or advocated for eugenics, contributed to the ongoing dispossession of Native people to realize an idea of wilderness as a space for recreation for middle and upper class white folks. But beyond the issue of whether we ought to exalt Muir, this reckoning reflects some profound changes underway in how we relate to each other and to the non-human world. We were lucky enough to talk to 4 Californians who are participating in these changes. Ron Goode is the tribal chairman of the North Fork Mono tribe and a practitioner of cultural burning and other forms of traditional ecological knowledge, near parts of what has been called John Muir country. Sandy Hernandez is a volunteer with Latino Outdoors who is working to diversify the world of outdoor recreation and visitation, and she's a ranger with the National Park Service in Yosemite National Park. Leah Mata-Fragua is a northern Chumash artist, professor, and cultural practitioner who advocates for indigenous peoples' access to their homelands, and she has grappled with the effects of climate change and environmental degradation on traditional practices. Char Miller is an environmental historian at Pomona College and the author of numerous relevant books, most recently Hetch Hetchy, A History in Documents. It's a wide-ranging conversation that is not really about John Muir at all, but about us and the world around us, and where we want it to go. I hope you find it as illuminating as I did. Could you introduce yourself and your environmental work?
Good morning, Manahu. I am Ron Goode, the tribal chairman of the North Fork Mono tribe. The tribe is one of the lead tribes in the state of California dealing with environmental issues from water, fire, archaeology, cultural resources. So we've been working with our lands and with agencies for over 30 years that we've been actually on projects. And we are a tribe that have lived here in this middle of the Sierra Nevadas. Our main county that our homeland takes in is Madera County, all of eastern Madera County, a portion of Mariposa and a portion of Fresno, and a little bit of Inyo. So we have about 1.4 million homeland acres in which we take jurisdiction over. We are not a federally recognized tribe. We are a state recognized tribe, but we are an Aboriginal tribe who has never relinquished our sovereignty. So that's where we come from. And so when we deal with agencies and environmental groups, then we're coming from somebody that's been here on the land for thousands of years.
Hello, my name is Sandy Hernandez, and I'm a volunteer with Latino Outdoors, and I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. So Latino Outdoors is really all about inspiring, reconnecting, and engaging the Latinx community in the outdoor space, and really helping them understand that embracing cultura and familia are indeed part of the outdoor narrative. And so it is a Latinx-led organization. We are functioning nationwide. We have 22 chapters across the nation in places like Fresno, Las Vegas, New York, Seattle, and just about 120 volunteers nationally as well. And we're all taking on roles as like ambassadors. Myself, I'm an outing leader. We have program coordinators as well, and so many more roles. And the goal really with having these many volunteers is to create a national community of leaders that are part of the world of conservation and outdoor education. And Latino Outdoors really wants to just amplify and expand the Latinx experience in the outdoors, where we have historically been underrepresented, in the world of conservation, the world of environmental education, the world of outdoor recreation. And so something else that our volunteers also do is to take on engaging Latinx families, taking them on numerous activities in outdoor spaces for all ages, for all generations, including bilingual and Spanish-speaking programs. So I am also someone who works at a national park, and so I will be sharing a little bit of that experience that I have observed through that working that career field as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, I guess I'm next. I'm Leah Mata-Fragua, and I am a member of Yaktitu Titu Yaktilhini, known as Northern Chumash. Our homelands are the Central Coast in San Luis Obispo County area. For those of you that know my work, I do wear many hats. I'm an adjunct professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. I also serve on our tribal council. And I'm also an artist working in place-based arts. So most of my career is interacting with place, with our environment. And so understanding our relationship and access to our materials or to tribal communities within California is something that I am incredibly passionate about and concerned about, and an advocate. So I'm very involved with my community in terms of environmental protection and access to resources. And so that's just a little bit about what I do and the community I come from.
My name is Char Miller. I'm an environmental historian at Pomona College in Claremont, California, which has 2 ancestral villages of the Tongva people. I teach courses, and I'm lucky to have students who are deeply interested in environmental justice, political issues that surround the environmental movement, but much more broadly, how we live in place, to go to Leah's point, and how that recognition of place, whether it's a watershed, a mountain range, coastal, it doesn't really matter what, really does often inform how we understand our location in that environment and who we get to work with and who we get to recreate with. I spend a lot of time walking the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, and it's out of those sort of wanderings that a lot of the ideas that I get to play with in class emerge, because it's a vista over an incredible valley with millions of people, and you suddenly understand the dynamic between, or at least the modern dynamic between human beings and the natural world.
Leah recently co-wrote a letter, "We are still here, John Muir is not." Could you tell us about it?
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge Ade and Fred Briones, Rebecca Torres, Jennifer Malone, Hillary Rennick, all of them who contributed to the article. It was a collaborative effort, and it speaks to the resiliency of tribal communities, right? And our pushback on John Muir's narrative, right? Which pretty much totally dismisses tribal communities and their traditional ecological knowledge and their thousands of years of relationship to their place and their homelands. And so when we talk about John Muir and his legacy, we're really talking about someone who completely ignored and sometimes even had, racial thoughts against Indigenous people and African Americans. And so because of his privilege and because of his time and place, he was able to have that dominant narrative that the Sierra Club still kind of follows today. And so being able to push back on that with other Indigenous people is inspiring, and also I hope that it resonates with a lot of other tribal communities that it's okay to push back, and that we need to push back on some of those false narratives, because our relationship to place and our traditional ecological knowledge is important. And we had thousands of years of relationship prior to John Muir. And everything he says and does isn't always the correct way, or the way that Indigenous communities would manage land or think of conservation. And so I think it's an important conversation, especially now with climate change, and looking at solutions to how to mitigate some of those changes that are happening. How do we do that? And how do we include voices of Indigenous people who have been either displaced, not recognized, been discarded, pushed out of even accessing some of their resources? And so it's really been eye-opening to see how much this article resonated with both Native and non-Native people who are interested in conservation.
What is your take on Muir and the legacy that surrounds him?
I can talk a little bit. So, yes, the legacy of John Muir, as well as many others right now, are being challenged in a new way. And we need to, like Leah was talking about, we need to analyze, the work that he did in conservation to help preserve a place like Yosemite as a national park, as well as other public lands. But we also need to reconcile his views towards Black people, towards Indigenous people, that really develop from harmful stereotypes. So it is very complicated the way that I see it. And, these issues are currently being talked about in places like Yosemite and across the National Park Service. And it's necessary and very important to have these conversations. And when I think about John Muir and his legacy, I really think about the way that he is often portrayed as a lone white man, like out in nature's wilderness. And this image alone, to me, really excludes so many people from having a relationship with nature. It really excludes so many people from the nature narrative. And so I think about the way that we need to reimagine the way that we portray nature. And nature is not some, something that you experience in some faraway land all by yourself. Nature could be urban. It could be in your neighborhood park. It could be in your backyard. It could be a carne asada by the river with your family and friends. The image that has been portrayed by John Muir, it continues to be used by things like outdoor magazines, outdoor organizations, just as an example. So we really need to reimagine this legacy of Muir that we have to include a more inclusive way of portraying the outdoors and its stewards. And so, yes, that, and also when we have these organic conversations, especially with Black communities, with Indigenous communities, we really need to think about the people that we have been praising all these times, and think about other figures that we can praise that normally have not been praised as heroes. And so I think about that, and I think about these changes that are needed in this outdoor narrative, and I think about how that change starts here with us having these kind of conversations. So that's the way that I see John Muir's legacy.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. Personally, I try not to have any thoughts or relationship to him, but I will start with this, and that is when I told my wife that I was on a panel about John Muir. She says, "Oh, you're not going to beat up my last white hero, are you?" I laughed. I didn't answer her. But as Sandy was talking about there, what happens where we are today and maybe where we're going? A lot of conservation groups, I'm doing interviews and articles daily, and with people from Plant Society, Sierra Club, a number of these organizations that as Native people, we have always seen as not being proactive with us, or somebody that we want to have a relationship with. So what they are now doing, of course, is trying to come forth with a stronger concept to conservation, and and how they wish to share with people how they are viewing how the environment should be. But there lies the problem. Um, Whether you're talking about an agency or a conservation group, and I don't care to what degree of conservation group you're talking about, they're not looking at the land as a landscape that includes everything on the land. And so when we are out on the land, we are not just taking care of our needs. We are not just looking to what an endangered species is, or who needs, what have. There is no such thing as management, but yet that is all that our agencies do. It is the same concept that our conservations look at. And it basically is what John Muir came forth with, because he came with that colonial attitude that we still have today. And so the exciting thing about to listen to somebody like Sandy talk, because I'm in my work right now, I'm at an age to where I'm trying to build a youth movement. And I have people all over the United States and Canada and south of the border who I'm looking at the youth to come along, because we cannot change where we are today. Where we are today is still run by the old people with the old concepts and the old way of doing things, and they can't change that. They're not going to change. And I'm working with professors who are trying to change, but if I'm working with a Berkeley, I've got 3 or 4 good professors, and there's 3 or 4 that are not so good. So it doesn't matter where you're at, we still have this whole thing going on. And so, why I would join something like a panel to be able to listen to you guys, but also have a chance to say in terms of where we need to go and what we need to do. So I'll come back and talk a little bit more about Mr. Muir. That's enough for now.
So if I can, I love this conversation. First of all, it's really quite exciting, and it's the kinds of conversations that my students and I have on a daily basis. We're reading actually Decolonizing is Not a Metaphor this afternoon. So it's a live conversation, and it is, I think, given that we are talking about Muir, which frankly has never been my hero. I don't like the way he writes. I mean, it's also partly just the way the narrative is constructed as a narrative. I'm not a big fan of romantic writing, and his is totally that. And that goes to your point, Sandy, of sort of the lone guy up on the mountaintop, prophetic and speaking down to those in the valley. Without seeing where he actually is. And when he does see the Mono people, for example, it is some of the most egregious language I've ever read in a text. And he decries them as he's coming through one of the canyons and up through the ridges, as the moment they left, the wilderness returned. And you suddenly see in that sentence, racism is clear, but also the way in which, for his readers, he also erased for them the understanding that there was actually a people there who lived there, who managed that space, who had been there for thousands of years. There's a lot to talk about with him, but not just him. And I want to come back to Ron's point also, that there are institutions that emerged in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the Forest Service, the Park Service, ultimately the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife. And they're analogs at the state level, and they're analogs at the county level, and they're analogs at the city level, all of whom, for whom land is a manageable commodity. Property matters, and ownership of property matters in a way that conflicts, obviously, with the ways in which Ron, Sandy, and Leah have all spoken. So it isn't just whether there's 3 or 4 faculty at Berkeley or 3 or 4 faculty at Pomona College or wherever they may be. We're talking about systemic change that is so profound from the land up that it's going to take more than one generation of young people, I think, Ron, for that change to happen. I've been very lucky in my 40 years of teaching to have kids who are right there. but it's been 40 years. And I'm about to retire at some point soon. I think this conversation is actually going in a direction that is systemic, which it has to be, that is disruptive, which it has to be, that is driven by different conceptions that have been so institutionalized that the institutions, let alone the institutional way of thinking, has not been directly, fully, or maybe not even partially challenged. And so one of the things that because I speak a lot to the Forest Service, I remind them that close to 50% of their land, 50% of 193 million acres actually came from ancestral, tribal, and treaty lands that were taken in the early part of the 20th century. The very basis of an agency, and obviously the Park Service is the same way, is founded on settler colonialism, and it's shaped by that. And thus, to work within the agency, even for me to come from the outside to tell them what they're seeing and to help self-reflect, I'm coming from a settler colonist position also. So it's not clear to me that these big changes that we need to pursue, even as we put Mr. Muir on the bench, are going to be easily resolved, whether it's me as an educator, me as a kind of a speaker, and frankly, for all of us on this conversation, this is an enduring discussion that's going to last the rest of our lifetimes.
What new directions do you see?
That's a fantastic question. Tribally, let's talk tribally first before I come back into where I'm at. Tribally, statewide, we have tribes that are growing and are out there on the land trying their best and their hardest to create a partnership with agencies, with governmental bodies, with the people, going back into their own homelands and either trying to put fire on the ground or trying to take care of their resources. But the problem is they're still meeting numerous challenges. And so a couple of examples, I work with UC Davis, and UC Davis works with Yocho Dehe, and they work with the Washu people, Maidu people. And so when they go out with these folks and they might be doing a cultural burn, putting fire on the ground, taking care of their cultural resources, they could have everything in place, all their elders, all their volunteers, all their agency people, and then get told that they can't burn, that they, this is just not a good burn day. And so therefore, no matter what you have, you're not burning today. And, this is the kind of challenge and hurdles that are throughout the state. And sometimes it may be, a CAL FIRE decision, or it may be an air pollution decision. I work in 4 different counties, Mariposa, Madera, Fresno, and Tulare. I work with Sequoia Park in Tulare, and we have a lot more liberty than the forests do. And then within the counties, Madera and Fresno, I pretty much have to follow whatever the guidelines are, when I can burn, what I can burn, how I can burn. In Mariposa, it's a whole lot different. I am in a different air pollution territory. And so for the past 10 years, I've been able to burn when I want, how I want, with whom I want. And I have a permit that just it's a cultural burn permit that allows me to burn basically from January to June. If it's a bad air day or it's a no burn day, I'm still burning. But after all those years of doing that, this past year was the first year that I got a lot of guff and a lot of questions, because we have a lot of turnover with new people. But we managed to move forth and do our cultural burning. But I'm just pointing this out, that there are still so many different hurdles that we're having to go through Some of the tribes up north, they burn with the Trex program, a program in which their people all go through a red card process, and they all dress up in their little yellow suits, and they all can go out there and put fire on the ground and get their work done, get their cultural resources restored. Well, if that's what you have to go through, then you do what you need to do. But these are things where I'm at, I refuse to do. If you want to join me and burn with me, you can come join me and burn with me. And so we move forward, and on that same token, we have created what we call a master agreement with the Sierra National Forest. Took me 5 years to get it written. Took me 3 years to get it implemented. And we are still working on the final outcome of how we're going to get that done. And it may be another 2 years. So, before it's all said and done, it'll be 10 years. But what will happen is that I will be doing my own burning on federal lands. And that is, of course, has already raised the ire in Colorado and Washington, D.C., It's kind of like, what? You're allowing the Indians to do what? And so, we still have a lot of hurdles to go through and a lot of movement to do. But at the same token, I have tribes and federal agencies in Florida, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Oregon, even Canada now, that are all looking at what we are doing. And as a tribe, I just got done with an interview with German TV, and now I've got another one with Finnish people coming up. And so there are people all over the world that are now looking at what we are doing and how we are doing it. So this is, I think, something that's really important. At a time when, there was the governor was putting a price tag on Indian heads. John Muir was coming through when supposedly the Indians were already corralled, which was not true. But at the same time, this allowed a man like him and many others, and I've written them all about them, to move into our areas pretty much untouched. And he did some really good stuff, and he did recognize, a lot of things. But here's what he recognized with us when he got into Mono country. He made a very simple statement that when the Mono stepped out of their bark houses, they stepped into a Garden of Eden. And that was basically the end of his statement. But from there, why was it a Garden of Eden? And why did the Indian people create a Garden of Eden? I was out on the fire yesterday, and we're looking at cultural resources and damage to some of the cultural resources. But this is all part of the topic that we were talking about in terms of when the Indian was living on the land and what that meant compared to what we are today. And I make this statement public. We don't have anybody living on the land today. Nobody lives out there and says, I can live out here on this land and I don't have to go to the store and I don't have to have anybody bring me anything because I have everything right here. And that is, of course, not the case today. You would have to be able to go 10 miles to find any kind of food and any kind of resources. And, if you got a car, you're fine. You got a horse, you're fine. But back in those days, we had neither.
I'd like to pick up on a point that Sandy made earlier, that how we perceive nature has drawn attention to not just the Sierra, not just the Wasatch, not the San Francisco Mountains, whatever sort of high ground there might be, which is what sort of Muir claimed for environmentalism. But living in Los Angeles, it's very clear, whether it's the Santa Ana River, the San Gabriel, or the Los Angeles River, even more remarkably, there are now conversations about those spaces being natural systems, which you might not expect, even though they look like freeways, they're actually rivers. And that's really one of the key ways for urban areas to really begin to rethink themselves. And for me, that's an enormous amount of hope that you can start to re-riffle an LA river and bring back the salmon. The steelhead trout is kind of an ambition, but it's an extraordinary ambition. And I think that's part of what I think the conceptions that Ron has been laying out and Leah and Sand have been laying out are actually can be pivoted and pushed into urban landscapes that suddenly become locations that are healthier than they currently are. The LA Times today has this extraordinary GIS map that plots COVID air pollution, and in this case, obviously smoke over the last month and a half. And you can see that dynamic. And so part of what in a sort of 21st century environmentalism has to reconceive of the places where the vast majority of Americans live, regardless of their affiliations, are in urban centers. And that to me seems to be where the action has to go. As much as I love the Sierra and the White Mountains and other places, I have to pivot and think about the place that I occupy, and then begin to have conversations with the Tongva elders in Claremont and places like that, because we are having students work with them, faculty and students. And I find in that conversation, a re-indigenizing of place, partly by dynamic of plant and species, partly on the basis of the conversation itself, whether it's chaparral or coastal sage, whatever it is you're trying to reintegrate into a suburban landscape. It's a really critical conversation to have before you put shovel to ground. And I think that for me is a part of the hope that has emerged over the last 10 years or so.
I can talk a little bit about the changes I've seen to just access to public lands as well as environmental advocacy. So when I think back the last 2 to 4 years when I started working at a national park, I remember coming into the space and looking at social media to try to find other people that look like me, and how hard that was for me to do at that point. But luckily there were people like Jose Gonzalez, who is the founder of Latino Outdoors, who was using social media as a platform to make himself visible, but also very much like myself to try to find others that were like him. And so with social media being just the strong platform that it is, I was also able to find Latino Outdoors, as well as other organizations using social media platform like Melanin Base Camp, Outdoor Afro, Indigenous Women Hike, Brown People Camping. And in the last 3 to 4 years, I've seen that now we have like a field of wildflowers just blooming of social media accounts that are just creating a platform, just people creating a platform for themselves in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion in these outdoor spaces and conservation. And I think that's just really amazing in itself. And just from my experience of working at a national park, also, I have noticed in the last 3 to 4 years, there are more Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are visiting places like our national parks. And that is really important. So just as an example, in 2008, Yosemite National Park did conduct a visitor services project. And through that project, they found that only 16% of the visitors that were visiting the park were people that identified as Hispanic or Latinx. They found that 3% identified as American Indian or Alaskan Indian, and only 1% were Black or African American. So that's 16% Latinx or Hispanic, 3% American Indian or Alaskan Indian, and then only 1% Black or African American. And those numbers to me really shock me. And I think those numbers say so much for themselves. And I can have a whole conversation just about that. But one thing that I do want to say is that it really does matter in our parks who is working, at the visitor center desk, who is working at the campground offices, who's working at the entrance stations, what type of messaging and images are being portrayed by our parks. And just as a personal experience that I can share is I have encountered Latinx families that are visiting a national park. And I can see, the child in the backseat, like standing up, getting ready to translate for the Spanish-speaking parents, rolling down the window slowly so that I can see them, that they're going to be the ones communicating with me. And I can see their whole world just turn upside down and completely change the moment that they realize that I can communicate with them in Spanish. And you can see the whole family just kind of like relax and just fully be themselves when they have that moment of realization that they can communicate with me freely. And I can see the parents just kind of start asking questions that maybe they were too afraid to ask before. And just seeing this very simple interaction that I can have with a family, because I've been on those shoes and I've been in that place, and how I think about these changes as being positive to access to our public lands. And so changes that I do want to see more of is, what kind of people are people seeing reflected, as they come. So what employees are working at our parks, and also, people getting the chance to see more people that look like them when they visit our outdoor spaces. And so, again, these are the changes that I want to see more of. Yeah.
I think in my community, some of the hopefulness is the larger institutions reaching out to our tribal community to partner with us on projects that will help highlight not only our community, but the knowledge we have about our place. And we recently partnered with Cal Poly on their new dorm project. And basically we incorporated environment, place, and language into these dorms. As students come to Cal Poly and come to that area, when they live in those dorms, they're really going to see a reflection of place and our tribal community. It's incorporated in the language. Each building has a specific village name from our area. And what's unique about our villages and the way that we use language is we really talk about the resources that are in those places. And so we talk about place of the rabbits, or because if you need to go hunting to make a rabbit blanket, you need to know where they live. And so we have a village that's called the place of the rabbits. And so just using that as an example, we incorporated one whole dorm to represent Carrizo Plains, which is the place of the rabbits. And so we used colors and graphics and basket designs and elements of our knowledge of that place and incorporated it into the actual building. When students come there, they see what their surroundings have to offer just beyond a college campus that they go to. And so we were really able to create a sense of place and advocate for our place and educate people that come to our area about our place and our homeland and the relationship that we have with it. It also has an educational component, so it wasn't just slapping some graphics and indigenous language on a building. It incorporates more. So we have language and culture. We have a resource room that is solely dedicated to Northern Chumash culture and knowledge. And so being able to have a partnership with an institution that is supportive of your place, that is supportive of your community, is something that we haven't experienced in the past. It's something that's come up recently, and the interest in our community is becoming more of an interest to local people who had no idea that we even existed, or that we were even still working and having a relationship with our homeland, that we were still gathering and we were still needing our cultural resources. And so being able to educate people outside of our community about the importance to accessing our materials and accessing the things that we need to continue our traditional, or teaching our youth traditional knowledge, being able to access that is important. And so having advocates and allies is something I'm seeing a little more of more recently. as both Ron and Sandy had brought up, you know, there's multiple bureaucracies, right? I mean, we have Coastal Commission, we have state parks, county parks, national parks, we have all these bureaucracies, and each one requires a different liaison, a different approach, a different type of permit, and the high turnover rate. You can get a permit from a liaison and the next day they're not there and you're out gathering and nobody knows, and then someone else rolls up on you and they want to know what you're doing here, why you're here, how come you're taking this stuff, you know. And so it's difficult when you, especially for tribes that were either terminated or a part of the unratified 18 treaties in California. I mean, we have less of a voice than tribes that are federally recognized. And so it's a real difficult challenge to navigate all those bureaucracies and what they require. And you're in your own home. I mean, you're in your own home and you can't access the things that you need to sustain your community. And so just, you know, in the last 5 years, I would say we've had conservation groups or community groups, larger educational institutions, county supervisors reach out to us. And so that's been something that's been positive in terms of being able to have a larger voice in our own homelands.
Are there parts of Muir's environmentalism that are still worth adapting today?
You know, I think, you know, even like what my wife was saying, you know, there's a lot of places that are, you know, named for John Muir. There's a lot of good, at least there are preserves and the concept of what the people are trying to take care of, a piece of land that says, let's preserve something that's not going to be developed or, you know, used as an economic development. And so there's an importance, I think, to some of that as we look around today and see how much of our lands are being gobbled up by counties and by cities for development, and agricultural lands going by the wayside. 20, 30 years ago in Fresno County, 30% of our agriculture was on 30 acres or less. Today, you know, if there is a percentage, it's on 5 acres or less for the little ones. And the bigger ones have gotten bigger and stronger. But a lot of these folks, there's no reason for their next generations to take over farming and take over to do what they did, because, you know, the cost is too high for them, and just doing it because their love for farming isn't there anymore. And so we are not only losing there, but even out in whether you're on the coast or up in the mountains. And it's one thing to have parks and forest lands and wilderness. More and more, when you take a look back at what we have done, you know, here in America with our philosophical concepts of a wilderness, is, you know, that's exactly how they view it, is if you don't do anything with it, if you don't touch it, it won't cost you. And so consequently, I have been to, you know, with agencies in different places to where they shout out, you know, we need to go back to when things were wild on the land, you know, and just, you know, in their mind, they're saying, you know, this wilderness, oh my gosh, it just needs to stay that way. But you want to go back to when it was wild, when the grizzly bear was there, when the elk ran around out there? Or how about when the Indian was out there? How far back do you want to go to when the real wildness took place? And then when those folks were out on the land, they were taking care of the land. They were keeping the land open and not letting it go, not creating, a wildfire habitat. And that's pretty much what we have done today. And so, we've got a long ways to go. So I think that in a little bit of whatever legacy that Mr. Muir created and people are still attached to things that he has done, we need to build off of it. Maybe there's some improvement there, but maybe there's a whole lot more that we can do. Just like all of you are speaking today, it's just fantastic to listen to you talk. So that's my little say.
Well, the one thing I would say, and this is the historian speaking, so take it for what it's worth, is to recall the moment when in the late 19th century, much of this, this vision emerged. And for many of those who we now think of as sort of the leaders of that movement, Roosevelt, Pinchot, Muir, folks in the Audubon Society and the like, at the base of what they thought they were doing, they were challenging the Industrial Revolution. That this was the break, as Ron said, to sort of like, okay, slow down. Not everything has to be pillaged in some fashion or another. I think we're now a century plus into that system, and we're seeing where its flaws are. And as Mark David Spence and others have written about it, as he described it, dispossessing the wilderness was a mechanism by which you used state power, military, and preservationism to exclude. And it's not a surprise to me when the first national forests were created, they were called forest reserves. At the exact same generation where you're reserving people from the land, you're also reserving spaces for trees. One grew larger, another grew smaller, and there was a dynamic there that's critical also. But we're now wrestling, as Leah said, with a climate change, a radically altering climate. And so whether this structure that we built, at least in part as a buffer against the Industrial Revolution, is actually going to do much more than that, what it was designed to do, I don't know. I think we've got to be a hell of a lot more fluid than a concept of preservationism in the face of a dynamic system like climate change. That, as Ron said, is sort of touching off fires. It's not slowing this process down. And I don't know that we are, and I use this broadly, we are as adaptable as we need to be in the face of that enormous challenge. I don't think there's a park that you can create that you can say, okay, that just solved climate change. I don't think that's what we're dealing with any longer. And getting fire back on the ground, as Ron talked about it, is one mechanism. But our environmentalism, if that's what it's going to be, is going to have to be much more swift and much more nuanced and much more potent than it currently is. And I would say also a hell of a lot more inclusive.
Yeah, I agree with both Ron and Char in mentioning the importance of continuing to adopt preservation and then advocacy as well. So something that I often say when it comes to nature is that there is no us and them. When it comes to nature, it's just us. And in order to keep these outdoor spaces that we love relevant, in order to sustain them, we really need to think about who are we connecting to these outdoor spaces. We need to connect and reconnect people from all walks of life. And I say reconnect because so this is something I learned from Teresa Baker, who's also a large advocate for inclusion, diversity in these outdoor spaces. And I say reconnect because really when it comes to communities of color, it is about reconnecting. We have some very deep roots to when it comes to nature and land that were, given to us by our ancestors. And so we need to ask ourselves, how are we working towards having places like Yosemite that Muir fought so hard to protect, be more accessible to an ever-changing and ever-growing constituency. And I say this because California is actually one of 5 states where the minority population is actually numerically now the majority. And so when we are welcoming like ethnic and racial diversity and accommodating other cultural backgrounds, it really opens up the opportunity for people of color to have these experiences in these outdoor spaces that they're going to cherish for the rest of their lives. And so we do need more conservationists. We need more stewards of these lands. Otherwise, I can see us having places like Yosemite, places, like all these outdoor spaces that we love, I can see us losing all these places with like climate change and everything, as you all have mentioned.
In terms of John Muir's legacy, keep it or leave it, I think, you know, he was a deeply religious man, and felt, or some of his ideology is that, you know, this land is godlike. And it's very similar to when I read Spanish journals when they first came to California. In Crespi's journal, they talk about this land being so pristine that it's godlike, and that only God could have made it this way, and that so it kind of negated the relationship that people were having with their homelands in terms of keeping it and working and having a relationship to make it pristine. It's a relationship. I think that, you know, when we look at John Muir, or whether it's Crespi or anybody, you know, there's often this perception that we were just letting the land go wild, that we had no relationship, that it was just like this when they got there, and we had nothing, indigenous people had nothing to do with the land. And so I think getting rid of that perspective would be helpful, or that narrative, because when the Spanish got here, or John Muir, people have to realize that there were people here that had a relationship with their homelands, and that the pristine beauty that they saw was a result of those relationships. Because indigenous people haven't been able to have those relationships like they once had, being able to burn when they want to, or being able to do those things when they needed to be done without having to go through 20 bureaucracies where one tells you yes, one tells you no. You know, that really our best option for mitigating climate change is to work more with indigenous communities, and more bureaucracies understanding that God, our lands, while they might have been a gift from Creator or God or whatever your belief system is, that there's still some relationship going on to manage those and to work with those lands. And we can't just develop them, and we have to protect them, and we have to work with these bureaucracies. And bureaucracies really need to end up looking at, or looking to, indigenous communities to help mitigate those, and to look to Native communities, or make sure that Native communities or indigenous communities have a seat at the table when those negotiations are going on. So oftentimes when policies are being made, we're left out of those conversations. My son, who attends a tribal college and environmental studies, applied for an internship at the UC Davis Marine Biology Lab. And he doesn't go to UC Davis, but he got into the program. And it was one of the first indigenous students they've ever had. And his project was to work with abalone, which is one of the resources that our community uses. And, you know, we no longer have access to it. And it is a species that is in severe danger of disappearing. While he was there, he would say, well, they're working on policies. And I'm like, well, what other tribes are they working with or communicating with? And they're like, oh, there's I don't know. They're just making recommendations. And so often we're left out of those policies, we're left out of the recommendations. And so I think it's really important that we do have a seat at the table with these bureaucracies, because it takes all of us working together to mitigate the damage that's been done. And it's important to have diverse voices in those conversations, because it affects all of us. And I don't often see Indigenous voices in the policy level. And it's unfortunate.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, I had a good time listening to everybody. So very good.
Right.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, all.
Thanks. The issues raised in today's conversation may not easily resolve, and the legacy of John Muir is indeed complicated. Thank you to our panelists, Ron Goode, Leah Mata-Fragua, Sandy Hernandez, and Char Miller for this enlightening conversation. The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.